Hello and welcome to the World Built Environment Forum's webinar series. My name is Sophia Key, Head of Future Ready at WSP in the Middle East, and today's webinar will be discussing a very hot topic, heat resilience in urban environments, making our cities cooler. With the impact of climate change becoming more pronounced and the frequency of extreme heat events increasing, cities must find ways to mitigate prolonged periods of soaring summer temperatures. Heat waves and urban heat island effect caused by the mass of hard surfaces of concrete, brick and asphalt in cities place the elderly and those with chronic conditions most at risk. This webinar looks at the possible solutions from incorporating more green infrastructure and other passive to active technologies, and how a multidisciplinary approach by built environment professionals can make cities cooler. I'm delighted to introduce today's panelists. We have Dr. Ricky Nathvani, Early Career Professional Research Fellow, Faculty of Medicine, School of Public Health at the Imperial College, London. Nice to meet you, Ricky. Next, we have Olga Turner-Baker, MRICS, Managing Director at ECIS. Greg Katz, founder and CEO of the Smart Services Coalition. Hi, Greg. As an audience participant, we always actively appreciate your involvement. I encourage you to submit questions as we read through the panel, as it helps to bring the conversation to life. If you are new to these webinars, you can see that the submit questions at any time is at the question box on your screen. We can pick up as many questions as we can as we move through the session. Thank you so much for joining us today. Okay, so we're going to dive straight into the panel. How are prolonged extreme heat events affecting cities and inhabitants? So we had the hottest day on the planet in July. Hottest day ever recorded across the globe. So this is kind of really startling and puts the prioritization of making sure that we are protecting citizens with all of our design advice and all of our design decisions. I'd like to ask Ricky what your take is on this mitigation and how we can look at the health impact on people and ensure safety and well-being in warmer cities.
Sure, thank you. Can I confirm I'm coming through all right?
Yes, perfectly clear. Thank you, Ricky.
So, as Sophia mentioned, my background is in public health. In fact, it is originally in physics, and I've moved into the Department of Public Health from kind of a methodological background. And so, from an epidemiological perspective, an extreme heat event is a very geographic phenomenon, and I think that's kind of the first place to root this conversation. What we mean by extreme heat event has to be taken in the context of a given location. So, for example, in the UK, we define a heat wave or an extreme weather event as surpassing a certain temperature, and even within the UK, the temperature which defines a heat event is defined by the county. So the north will have something like a threshold of 25 degrees relative to, say, London, where you have to exceed 28 degrees for a certain number of days. But what that number means and how it's defined is different all over the world. And that has implications for how we think about things like heat action plans. So the way public health officials come up with the preventative strategies for making sure that support is available during these events. And we'll talk a little bit about later about how data can help us predict these heat waves and therefore be prepared to deal with the effects of heat waves on health, is very much defined by the definition of a heat wave in the first place. So that's something to be very aware of, is that there is no singular definition, and we should be very attentive to what we mean. But generally speaking, we're talking about exceeding some threshold of temperature over a given number of days. As for the actual impacts on health and what they mean, there's a huge range of impacts on both physical and mental health. That literature is becoming increasingly important. Primarily, we're talking about the very young, so those under 5 and those older than about 65 who are particularly vulnerable to particular health effects such as cardiovascular, impacts, because essentially one of the biggest physiological issues is your body has to work harder just to maintain kind of like homeostasis, and that leads to great stress on your liver, your kidneys, your lungs, and your general cardiovascular system. One of the big uptakes I want to mention, particularly for a crowd interested in the built environment, is a lot of the health burden during a heat wave is compounded with that of air pollution. So that's another, I mean, the actual health burden is particularly acute when those two things coincide. And so that's an important thing for us to consider, is as well as building cities that are responsive to cooling infrastructure, are we structuring cities in a way that reduces the presence of pollution? Because that will have as much of an impact on terms of reducing the burden to health as will, say, introducing adaptive measures that others will be talking about, like trees and cooling infrastructure. So yeah, and then kind of talking about the effects on people, that is also hugely differentiated by the built environment. To take an example, in Delhi, for example, in informal settlements where there's a prevalence of metal sheet roofing, the temperatures have been observed to be 9 degrees higher potentially. I might need to double check that, but at least 7 to 9 degrees higher than nearby rural areas. So, you know, we're talking about vulnerable populations whose built environment really exacerbates the effects of heat. And from a public health perspective, demography, geography, and vulnerable populations all need to be considered. So it's having a huge impact. The mental health impacts are also there. There's a greater number of accidents on hot days. It's often compounded with things like flooding. So absolutely a huge issue, and I'm sure many of the others will be sharing our strategies for dealing with that.
It's interesting actually, because being based in Dubai, we are used to those over the threshold temperature moments for a big portion of the year. So for example, it's 41 degrees today in Dubai. And I believe if you take the heat measurement on the pavement or on the road, you're 50 plus. So there's knock-on effects in terms of everyone migrating indoors. Again, kind of putting the onus on the designers and the built environment to create healthy, active environments inside. But also it increases the amount of public transport or single-use cars that everybody uses, because it's just more comfortable to get straight into a car than it is to walk somewhere at the moment. So yeah, this is a very pressing issue in the Middle East, and I'm very, very interested to hear how we move through the questions today so that we can apply some of this amazing knowledge here. I wanted to ask a question. Is there such a thing as urban heat inequality? So are the open spaces, greenery, kind of these less hard surfaces and hard environments available just for affluent city neighborhoods? And how can they mitigate the worst effects of intense urban warming?
Very big discrepancy based on income in the US. It's actually probably one of the worst racial structural inequalities that we have. You have as Ricky said, you have rising temperature. You have an urban heat island effect because of dark impervious surfaces, lack of trees. That adds about 3 degrees C. But the delta within cities, to your point, is very much differentiated by income, so that on average, low income neighborhoods in the US are about 10 degrees hotter Fahrenheit 6C than wealthy parts of the city. In Dallas, it's about 12 to 13 C. In Baltimore, which we're working with to resurface all of the city, it's 9 degrees C. And that's because these are areas that are paved over with very dark materials. Tarmac reflects only 10% of incoming sunlight, so it's all absorbed. The surface temperature will get to 170 Fahrenheit. And the consequences are enormous. And those in Europe and India, where we started to work, are really primarily economically determined. In the US, there's a racial overlay as well. Obviously, there's some overlap, but these are reinforced by redlining policies in the US for about 30 years. in the middle of the last century. So it's probably the single largest environmental justice issue in the US. And just to build on what Ricky said, it is very much determined by your zip code, your income, the quality of life, whether your kids can be outside, whether they're likely to suffer asthma and allergy, what their energy bills are. All of that depends on where you live, and that difference is driven economically, primarily outside the US, and in the US it's driven by race and economics together.
I'll just piggyback off that comment. Absolutely. There have been so many studies, and that observation holds up across the world. I'll point out one interesting outlier to what Greg mentioned, which is there are two cities where actually the more affluent are more exposed to the urban heat island. One is Sao Paulo, South America. The other is actually here in London, which I think is worth reflecting on, and absolutely for an advocacy case as well. Air pollution is most concentrated in affluent areas, but that is an extreme outlier. And as Greg said, generally around the world, income is a protective factor against exposure to urban heat islands.
So we still look a long way away from having urban heat equality across the world. It's I wasn't aware of that, and that's a definite take home. I wanted just to move on to the infrastructure in cities, because we rely so much on that infrastructure system working. Why with cities getting hotter, darker, and more unequal respite from the policies and funding, how are the policies and foundation funding set to address urban heat in the infrastructure sector, Greg?
I think pretty poorly. There's been billions of dollars of foundation funding and grants into cities for temporary programs, subsidies. And the problem is when the subsidies go away, the pilot projects end, it's back to business as usual, which is Department of Transportations around the world. They go to lowest first cost, which means dark and impervious. And so during this billions of dollars in funding over the last 30 years, it's pretty universally true that cities have become hotter, darker, more impervious, more unequal, and more prone to flooding. So policies, not to put too fine a technical term on it, kind of suck and need to get much better. It needs to be done on an integrated strategy. Cities need to think about all of their surfaces as if there were a cloud or sun. So looking down, is that surface going to bounce light back up into the air and out of the atmosphere, which causes global cooling? So that heat is not retained, re-radiated, heating people up in the day and even more at night, which is where you're getting heat deaths. Last summer, 60,000 excess heat deaths in Europe, primarily under dark surfaces. So the infrastructure decisions made by the city are made very narrowly around lowest first cost. We have to help them make a broader, more intelligent, less stupid decision to think about the larger secondary impacts, including increased heat burden for city employees, and higher energy bills for the city, adverse impacts on things like employment and health insurance. And so once a city can think holistically about how to manage sun and rain across surfaces, the world opens up, and now they can start making smart decisions rather than ones that make their citizens more prone to flooding, more prone to mold, more prone to overheating.
And then hopefully the onus will be less on the built environment to cool the buildings based on that, very strong radiant heat. And what's very interesting is if I look at a city that I started my career in, Singapore, it was a true green city. It was very, very hot, but you're constantly protected by this canopy of trees. And that layer and that row of trees was integrated throughout all of the streets. We had significant rainfall, but everything was captured. And I really do feel the most successful implementation of something like that is having the government and legislation being uniform across the whole island. I mean, it's only a 40-kilometer wide island, so the governance is very, very strong in implementing greenery and surfaces, permeable surfaces. And I kind of feel that that's potentially the main barrier in making sure that we implement these strategies across a whole nation, or
Yes,
because
you're
of that?
right. Cities are the
Yeah,
right place to do this
yeah,
because they control the budget. Because if you ask a city mayor or council, hey, do you care about your citizens' well-being or climate impact from the city or risk profile? The answer is yes. And so the question is, since cities lack the data and tools to shift from least first cost to a fuller, more sophisticated decision-making strategy that ignores today 90% of the impacts, what are the tools that we can bring to bear? Because city managers want to do the right thing, but if they lack the tools and data to shift from lowest first cost to an integrated approach, they need support in doing so. That's what the Smart Surface Coalitions was designed to do. And our partners range from the American Public Health Association through the World Cement Association. It's very pro-business and pro-environment. And the logic is compelling in terms of narrow self-interest. So for example, city credit rating determines city access to funding through municipal bond markets. City credit rating is determined by three rating agencies, principally S&P and Moody's. They've issued notices saying they care a lot about climate, and they're looking at city risk from a structural risk perspective based on whether they're getting their act together on climate. So cities that fail to take the kind of steps that you've described, Sophia, for Singapore, that is going to be viewed negatively. And then you get into a situation you can borrow less money, your borrowing costs go up. There's more of an economic burden, there's reduced services, and there's a potential for urban areas to go into a cycle of economic failure unless they get out in front of this heat and climate issue.
Because the people are our manpower. The health and well-being is so important for many businesses, major businesses located in urban environments in city centres. And it's almost like the business case for productivity and well-being, based on our essential asset, which is people being able to come into the office, people being able to collaborate. I hate to say we have to look for the financial case, but sometimes we do need to look at kind of that business case in ensuring health and well-being, both in the built environment and in urban environments. So I'd like to talk about how cities can protect themselves from extreme climate conditions. I think we're all pretty aware that the temperatures and the weather events that we're experiencing currently will become more frequent and more intense. There are particular data websites online, and I was looking this afternoon, and Dubai is projected to hit 56 degrees Celsius by the turn of the century. So we're dealing with this dual challenge of increased heat to deal with, and also the aspirations of reducing carbon. So I'd like to kind of really talk through with Olga on how we can better design our buildings. So obviously our operational energy is contributing to around 40% of carbon emissions in the industry. So we have a key kind of chunk of impact that we can make globally. What context or themes do you see around the design of built assets and materials and orientation, for example?
Yeah, I think there's so many ways in which you can mitigate against heat, and I think we've touched on some of them today, but I think the most important thing is having that comprehensive strategy. So whether that's at policy level or whether it's emulating what some cities do, where they have a chief heat officer, it really depends. But I think the most important way of protecting and designing cities to mitigate against heat is that comprehensive strategy. So it starts, I think, from the outside in. So you start with this sort of master plan city scale level interventions, like the surfaces that we were talking about earlier, the reflective surfaces, simple things like tree covering. If we look at deciduous trees, they're a fantastic urban solution. They're mitigating against pollutants. They're protecting us during the hottest heat waves in terms of shade, and also if their surfaces overheating. It's also shown that people's educational achievements are higher in tree-lined streets. So you start to see this real multitude of it when you do design cities to protect against those kinds of pressures. You can also look at some research coming out on green building envelopes. I think some of that research is fascinating, showing that green building envelopes have a significant cooling impact on that building itself. It can be up to 10 degrees. Also, again, the other positives, the unintended positive consequences of those green building envelopes, where we know that they can reduce particulate matter. And it was interesting that Ricky said air pollution goes kind of hand in hand with some of the biggest risks of overheating, right? And we know that, from a report actually that Arup did, that green building envelopes can reduce particulate matter by 10 to 20% in that immediate area. So again, really interesting. And acoustic impacts as well. We know that urban noise is a big. So that's kind of what we can do at that master plan city level. But we can also start thinking about the building itself. There's a multitude of strategies, but I think we so often see only one really focused in on, and not the whole spectrum. So I think it is definitely up to planners across the world to really make sure their policies are tight. So that means looking at things like reflective glass on buildings in terms of practical solutions, making sure that's not coming in. Lighter exterior materials. There are some fascinating stats that dark brick, black brick, and black cladding can actually make the surface temperature 20 degrees hotter than exterior surrounding temperature. Wow. And we look at the black cladding everywhere, we see it all over Design or things like that. We're not often thinking about is there a right context for that type of surface? So we're thinking about the skin, and then coming into the building we're thinking of thermal mass. And really, some of the oldest buildings in the world were the best of that, rammed earth wall construction, really thinking about those natural solutions as well as the mechanical type. Insulation, when we look at something like passive house buildings are actually very good at keeping the heat out. Again, we're thinking about that strategy of keeping the heat out of the building before we even start worrying about having to push it out with mechanical systems. And then finally, materials like clay and things like that are also really fascinating for their ability to regulate heat. So it goes without saying, it's a multifaceted approach, and it requires all the disciplines to work closely together. And I think we work with global standards like WELL, being one of the first consultancies to be a health and wellbeing consultancy for the built environment. And the beauty of these frameworks is they do create that holistic approach. So whether you're doing something like WELL building standard, thermal comfort is a huge part of it. So yeah, my kind of view on it is how the city's designed, not really that well, but everyone's joined up. But when we begin to join up those conversations is when we start to see those benefits.
Yeah, and I think a passive house and the facade is very, very key in this, especially if we look at health impacts from having an internal environment that has high temperature fluctuations internally. So what we're really trying to create with our buildings, and the key really lies within the facade and the outer skin, is that it's protecting the occupants from extreme fluctuations of temperature or cold, depending on where we are in the world. And I think in the Middle East, we're just starting to, or it's in infancy and not as mature as the UK in terms of using insulation, insulating walls, because it's traditionally been associated with cold weather. And it's not. Insulation is there for both extremes. And one
of the things, Sophia, on the Middle Eastern examples you're providing, they're getting into shaping the areas around the buildings. So an architect will have a footprint of 2 acres and build on a third. And what you do in the area around it has a huge impact. If you look at schools, for example, schools are commonly shutting 1, 2, 3 weeks earlier because of heat. Yeah. What are schools surrounded by? Well, they're surrounded by dark, impervious surfaces. They don't have trees on the south and west side of the building keeping out sunlight. Those passive measures, trees on southwest side, and then resurfacing the areas around the building, in addition to what Olga's saying about the skin and a reflective surface and an insulated surface on the top, or a green roof on the top, that can get you 5 degrees Fahrenheit cooling and allow schools to continue to operate, and operable windows to be open so you don't have concentrations of pollutants. To what Ricky was talking about earlier, you get equivalently higher CFM, cubic feet per minute. So the impact on specific, very vulnerable, high person concentration communities, particularly schools, is an area where the sort of beginning of architects saying, I'm just concerned about my beautiful building, to saying, oh, wait a minute, the quality of life and functioning of that building depends on the areas around the building. I need to start thinking smart about parking lots, roads, and all that stuff that's adjacent to the buildings. That's just beginning, but it's essential.
Absolutely. And sorry, go on, Ricky.
I was just going to mention, talking about kind of synergizing lessons from across continents, exactly as Greg said, there are often competing desires that might inhibit certain things. So, talking about white rooftops, I was speaking to some house developers in Accra, the capital of Ghana, saying, oh, what measures are being used to kind of improve albedo and reflectance? And they said there's no point in keeping the rooftops white for the most part, because every year, and this is true for a lot of West Africa, where urbanization is happening fastest, there's going to be 1 billion people living in this environment by the end of 2050. But because of the sub-Saharan dust storms, which carry through this red dust like clockwork every year, all of the rooftops wind up kind of like muddy, reddy brown. And so that's the color that is used to create these rooftops, because people realize, if my beautiful white paintwork is going to get covered in dust every single year, what's the point? And the kind of aesthetic concerns are also having significant impacts.
I would just say on that, I lived in Cairo worked as a journalist a long time ago, and lived through the Khamsin, that equivalent, right, of the dust storm for many days. At the end of that period, it's pretty inexpensive and cheap to sweep and then spray that roof, so it comes back to a much higher reflectivity. And as was pointed out earlier, that can make a difference of 5 or 10 degrees inside the home. And so these are parts of the world where labor is not expensive, where people have access in urban areas to water, where these kind of events you're talking about occur once a year for a long period. At the end of it, to go and clean that roof and restore it to high reflectivity is a very low cost in exchange for the benefits of keeping the occupants much cooler.
Great point.
I'd like to talk now about adaptive transformation with buildings, particularly as we're discussing the facade. So in Dubai at the moment, a lot of our building stock is coming up to the 25-year mark, where it's time to replace and retrofit facade systems. And I'd really like to discuss globally, and particularly in the UK, any lessons learned there, because where I'm going with this question really is that we are projected to be experiencing a different climate globally to what we're experiencing today. So I'd like to ask the panel, are there any particular recommendations in terms of design and installation that would allow for ease of retrofit in the future? I guess if no one has anything.
I would just say you kind of want to start with, don't do something stupid in your initial design.
Yes.
Once you've made a road dark, it's expensive. It's in the order of about $1 a square foot to resurface it. Once you've put in a dark roof, particularly a steep slope roof, which is common in U.S. residences, it's very hard to change it. So you want to start by not doing stupid things.
Yeah.
And then second, the opportunities for retrofit are very high. So there's one of our initiatives working with 25 cities, a dozen of which have started resurfacing roads, and they're cooling the ambient temperature in adjacent residential by 3/4 of a degree centigrade. So the opportunities for fast retrofit, and we talked about deciduous trees on the south and west side of buildings, you're keeping sunlight out of buildings, the opportunity to add bioswale features, the opportunity to take a roof, as Ricky said, you do a super highly reflective roof, and you want to make sure that the water drains through gravity in a pipe off that. And because it's gravity fed, you can go 100 yards away, it comes up in a bioswale, manages all that water, you have moisture available to drive evaporation or evapotranspiration, which is an important cooling mechanism for cities. And so first, don't do something stupid, and second, there are a set of interventions that are very cost effective and fast to make our cities much more livable, especially for the most vulnerable populations.
We need a facade engineer on the call, really, but I think that's the answer, really. There are plenty of very facade engineers, and I think it's about asking the right questions. I think it is a really good question about in those design team meetings when you're creating that building. Ask that question to the facade engineer. Don't just wait for them to do minimum building regulations. Ask these questions and say, can the system be designed in a way to mitigate heat? What have you thought about? And I think we all need to ask more of those questions in those meetings.
Absolutely, yeah.
Overheating agenda, because if it is a policy, it's going to get overlooked. So I think it's get it into those design briefs, in the early days. You know, we always talk at Ethos about the importance of, you know, strategy and then delivery. If you don't have it in your strategy from day one, when you appoint your design team, this is our company strategy, this is what we stand for as a developer, overheating is one of them, you're never going to get your design team to put it in. So when you do get 25 years down the line, like you say, to replacement, no one knows because it wasn't in the briefs. So write really good stuff at the beginning, write really good frameworks, and talk about these issues at the start if anyone on the call is in that side of the built environment.
Definitely, and I think our existing building stock is the key to this race to net zero. You know, reusing existing assets that have already been constructed in a way of being able to deconstruct a facade that doesn't significantly damage a structure behind it. And one of the most interesting parts of my role within properties and buildings has been talking to the engineers about a 100-year building. So I think we all wish or dream or accept that our buildings will be fit for purpose for at least 50 to 100 years, right? So if you discuss with a structural engineer, how long will your facade be performing for? They'll say 20 to 25 years. If you speak to a building services team, they might want the whole of their building services equipment replaced within 15 to 20 years. So you've got all of these moving parts. On top of that, we've also got changes in societal trends. So looking at having a building that can change from being a residential to an office space based on huge future demands. I think none of us really predicted the change in user patterns that we had post-COVID. You know, being able to live and work at home and really having a different need and use for our spaces. So it's embedding that flexibility within any assets that we're designing today so that it can be fit for purpose. And this is something that I really do like to challenge our engineers to say, like, which is the best facade that can be dismantled? Oh, well, but we don't design for disassembly. It's like, but we need to, because we understand the impacts of carbon, embodied carbon in building materials. So by oversizing facades or by designing structures for a future scenario does not make sense at the moment, because you're using too many materials for environment that is not currently being felt right now.
And the other thing is,
that
as
ease of
buildings,
adaptability that
the other thing is, as buildings, as you described, become more efficient and the embodied carbon becomes more important. So today, energy efficiency and Energy Star 90 or equivalent in the UK, it's about 10 years of operation to be equivalent CO2 impact from the embodied carbon. That's predominantly concrete. As a result, there's a real need for building owners to specify carbon intensity of concrete. Steel's about 80% recycled, so it's really concrete that dominates. I just posted a link to Carbon Star to the group, and this is the first, it's US and Canadian national standard being released next month with a very broad range of technical, government, industry, academic groups from places like MIT and Stanford. It's the first rigorous, simple standard specifying carbon intensity of concrete. So the San Francisco airport, going through an $8 billion upgrade, has good, better, best. Good is 200 pounds per cubic meter, which is half the industry standard. Better is zero net impact from carbon, and best is minus 200 pounds net sequestering. So the direction is good on operations, but it also has to be good and embodied. And to do embodied carbon reduction, you have to deal with concrete. This is a way to do it.
Oh, thank you for sharing that.
I might briefly put on my global health hat. I would also point out that, you know, we're talking about quite like sophisticated engineering problems, and absolutely we should be putting that attention, particularly where so much of the built environment is being constructed. But I would point out the kind of the population who will most feel the effects of extreme heat in sub-Saharan Africa and South Asia, East Asia, will be those living in informal settlements. And this is somewhere where, you know, the construction of the built environment is already very unplanned. The history of kind of the World Bank since the 1970s, you know, we've tried slum upgrading, as it used to be called. This is a huge focus. It's had very mixed effects. It can often end up leading to displacement and further vulnerability in populations. So just kind of highlighting that the technocratic view that just improving built environments will naturally lead to better outcomes isn't necessarily always going to transplant as a solution, particularly to those who are most affected by this issue.
Yeah, sorry, I was going to say unplanned settlements are really interesting, because then we start to have a look at like community spaces. So you might not be able to control, land ownership issues are often quite problematic in those parts of the world, but you can control public cooling centres, and that's something again that standards like, well, look at, is there somewhere free where the community can go that's either in a cold environment, actually, whether it's warm, and vice versa, in a hot environment that is cool and it's free. And really every city that's at risk from overheating should have these sorts of spaces, so that people on days of extreme heat can go and be in an environment that's not harmful to their health. I think that's what people in charge of these cities should be looking at, really.
Absolutely.
The healthcare system really should be seen as part of public health, like a hospital. These are going to become essential community assets, like cooling centres are going to become a fundamental resource.
Olga, you raise a really important question, which is who's responsible for cooling? Today, the cities say, oh, you're responsible, and even if you can't afford it, go buy air conditioning. So urban India, only 8% AC penetration. It's a dumb strategy, because adding a lot of AC which ejects heat, can heat the city by 1 degree C. Air conditioners stacked can preheat intake air by 5 to 8 degrees C, cutting efficiency by 40%. Of course, it's all peak load. Power failures are most frequent during the highest use of electricity, which is exactly when you need it. It's AC. And of course, all of these use as coolants, green high impact warming gases and as coolants. And so you end up with a situation where if you rely on the private sector to solve cooling needs through AC, you're adding close to 1 degree C of global warming, and you're making cities increasingly unlivable and at risk for the large majority of the population. So the answer has to be citywide cooling. So if you adopt citywide smart surfaces, you can cool a city by 3 degrees C and low income areas by 4 or 5. So you're cooling the city 10 times faster than it's warming. And so you get on this trajectory where it's getting cooler and cooler and cooler. And people don't then have to go out and buy air conditioners. And with all that entails in terms of CapEx and OpEx and all that entails in terms of ugliness, direct city heating, and contribution to global warming.
Okay, great. Well, I'll move on to the next question now. We've touched upon some technologies during our discussions, but I would like to have a look at, sorry, the next slide, please. Yes. How can buildings be better designed? So we were talking about passive design measures. I think the key here, from my experience with working with the architects very early on in the design process, is that we have so much data and technology available at our fingertips. We're kind of at this new age of data digitization. Everything is modeled and everything can be analyzed before we even lay a brick on a site. And I think Greg's point was very important, that when we're looking at a site, we're looking at the site in its entirety. How does the massing of that building affect the rest of the landscaping and the public open spaces, or the outdoor recreational spaces? So we can now take a model or a massing geometry and run it 1,000 different times with little tweaks of rotations and see which is the best performing building. And it's quite interesting, because we're running into this architecture being designed by robots type of scenario. So once we found our optimized massing and orientation, we find the best case solution, but often there's a lot of aesthetics and costs and all of these other factors that come into play, which I think probably halts us from doing the best thing every time within a design and scheme. So once we've had a look at the best passive strategies, I'd like to talk about the active technologies that we can use to sustainably reduce the impact of extreme heat in buildings, particularly as we're trying to hit these net zero targets in efficiency measures. We've got more heat coming in. It's like, what can we do to make our buildings a bit more intelligent? in terms of the amount of energy that we use. I'll pass that to Olga.
Thanks. Well, I guess we sometimes touch on it when we talk to smart building systems. You know, we can have buildings that tell people what part to go to, but depending on occupancy, right? Office buildings are getting really smart right now, where we can say on this occupancy, right, take this lift and I'll allocate you to the 3rd floor. So we could get really smart systems that say this part of the building is going to be easier to cool on this day, direct people to hot desk there. So I think in terms of, you know, active management, once we've done all the solutions we talked about earlier, like, you know, mitigating overheating, the orientation, the landscaping, the materials, I think we can start to use tech to be really clever, you know, and even look at the impact it has on occupancy, air quality, all that kind of stuff. So I think in terms of active technology, sensor technology is the best. And also you can look at people's personal preference for temperature and comfort. So again, personal choice is really important when we talk about overheating. You know, everything from the amount of clothing someone might be wearing on a typical day to how resilient they are. And they can choose which part of the building, if it is like an office or public space, that they go in. Their personal heat preferences. So that's where smart building tech and AI can really help, I think, on that front.
Absolutely, and I think it's a real change in mindset. Again, we look at, for an office building, for example, we're looking now at a change in schedules throughout the week. You haven't always got a building that's 100% occupied. You have pockets of the building that might not have anyone sat in there, but on certain days you've got a full office. And I think that those smart sensors and those occupancy based detection measures are really important in making sure that we use less energy, because the air conditioning and ventilation system does not need to be running at the same you know, power and exchange rate on a full day as you do on an empty day. And the same for the lighting. We have this balance here in the Middle East where we have a lot of sunlight, but the more glazing we include on building, the more heat that comes within the space. So it's getting that balance right. And looking at technologies, particularly around lighting. So if we have an open plan office, you'd want to have daylight sensors localized on the light fittings, so that the ones that are right next to the windows are not on. You know, it's actively responding to the environment and to the, you know, only using energy when it's needed. And I think that's so important as well when you look at productivity. Good lighting, good ventilation is very important, and it's a business case for asset managers. Reduce of absenteeism, the reduction of health issues. You know, the onus really is on the way that we design that building and understand how it's environment, you know, going to respond to the environment during use. I was in an office last year and I walked past the atrium, and there's this beautiful glazed atrium, and all of the employees were looking down at the atrium, and I saw one guy at the end and he had a pair of sunglasses on at his desk.
The health question's a really big one that you've pointed to, and it's probably a much larger economic impact than the entire utility bill. We just hired a team of graduate postdocs and MDs at the Harvard Graduate School of Public Health to do, for the first time, a really deep dive into Medicare and Medicaid data. They're the largest health data sets in the US, and we think we're going to be able to find strong correlations on a range of health impacts from changes in, you know, in air quality. And then just to add to Olga and your list of technologies, to add ground source heat pumps, tremendously valuable, cut heat load by 3x. They're not vulnerable to shut off in case of power failure. In many traditional societies, you have smart designs. So you're using thermal mass intelligently. Current buildings don't. You've got overhangs on windows, so the summer sun, the high angle summer sun doesn't come in. The low angle winter sun does come in, and we have completely forgotten that. So partly it's reapplying common sense from traditions that are native to Greece or to the American Midwest or to India. Partly it's incorporating new technologies that are logical, like ground source and air source heat pumps. And partly it's to your point about controls, and then of course adding solar. We've had solar in our home for 10 years. I'm very boring and nerdy for my kids, but I can tell you this one aspect of what I've done makes me seem vaguely cool to them, and that by itself is worth more than my entire energy bill. So I think that there's a combination of passive active technologies, refining our own sort of smart strategies, how do you manage sun intelligently, and then some of these sort of innovative sensor-driven occupancy use for lighting and air conditioning that you talked about.
Yeah, exactly. Couldn't have said it better myself. It's that whole process, and I think there's so many moving parts to this. And the key really to successful management of heat in cities is engaging all of the stakeholders on the same page. And this is, why a discussion and a panel today is so important, that we get so many different perspectives together and raise awareness within the industry, because we can't do it within our individual pockets of expertise. It has to be a holistic approach. So I'd like to just quickly move on to our final question, and then I'd like to open up for some questions from the audience if we can. We've got 15 minutes left. So the next slide, please. How can we better tackle extreme heat in cities? And how can stakeholders engage in that process? And how can we kind of influence the stakeholder engagement? How joined up is the approach amongst stakeholders at the moment to be tackling extreme heat and urban heat islands? How far away are we from getting that cohesive understanding?
It's a really interesting event. One of the best things to do to cool a city is to plant trees, being in the shade fields, 6-8 degrees C cooler. And of course, as we talked about, it keeps sunlight out of the south and west windows, which is the biggest heat gain for buildings. When you look at at tree planting measures, they're often not accepted by and embraced by the community, and trees die. So this strategy has to be from the ground up. So we're working with 60 African-American churches in 6 metro areas where they're getting the funding to do trees. They're doing the training, they're owning it, they're converting unused lots into parks, so that you don't have this park meadow. So you want to have everybody be able to walk within 10 minutes to a park. A second dimension of that is health. People look at health numbers, COPD and ppm, and and all of that, and they get confused. And so, how do you communicate something that people understand and trust? It's an area that obviously Ricky does a lot of work in. We've raised money for 2 partners, the American Public Health Association, the American Lung Association, to develop and communicate this data. It's going to include funding to 30 to 40 health groups in 10 metro areas. So on the ground groups that are already advocates for example, children's health or school performance or protecting the elderly or the at-risk, now have the tools and the data to communicate successfully complicated ideas and turn them into cost-benefit arguments for the city and for city managers, that is in the language of city managers, so it becomes persuasive. So I think that stakeholders, they're huge stakeholders, they're not well organized, they don't have the data, and there's often an unwillingness, if you will, to embrace a cost-benefit argument. So a stakeholder will come in and say, you should do this because it's right, and because my granny's sick and my kid's got allergies. Very good argument. But how much more powerful it is to say you should help my community, which has been racially disadvantaged or structurally at risk, and say, oh, and by the way, we can show you that doing so saves the city $5 for every dollar spent. And by the way, your policies to hurt my constituencies cost the city money, and I'm going to make sure that the people who vote know about that. That's a much more powerful argument.
And I think one thing that really stuck out to me is that the population or the people that are most vulnerable to these extreme heat events are those children and elderly age groups. And it would be very interesting to look at the economic impact of having people take a day off work because their child or their parents are sick. So, the impact that it would have on a business with absenteeism if those challenges aren't tackled. And I hate to kind of always bring it down to that economic story, but I think it's something that we could focus a lot more work and data research on is, absenteeism, looking after families, health impacts through unhealthy air quality, extreme heat. Because once we put all of that together, I think there's a very good business case for implementing a lot more measures throughout all of
There is also already research on like productivity levels and overheating. So, you know, for every few degrees too hot or too cold, you're massively reducing your productivity. So there's a really good business, you know, make an office environment in particular, or factories and things like that, where you can say actually people's productivity really dips when they're outside of those comfort zones. I've just seen a couple of questions come in from Giles. Is it worth just the ones that jump out?
I can't see them, so yeah, go ahead, please.
I'll that I can see, and maybe someone else can do some of the others. So conscious we've got 10 minutes. So I've seen the one about should we have windows that that can be opened rather than having them as sealed units. I think this one's quite interesting. So the standard I work with actually gives you a bonus point for operable windows, but it's all about management. It's how you manage those windows, and it's about education. So if you've got a really sustainable building where you've got all the aircon working, etc., to mitigating energy use, you don't want to then open that window and let out all that cool air. So I think firstly you need to communicate like when's the right time to open that window, and similarly on days when you've got like high levels of pollution, you need to communicate to the occupants of that building that it's not a great day to open the window. You need to rely on the system, the emission system, and its inbuilt carbon pollution filters, etc. So yes, it's generally good to have that flexibility to open a window, but it has to come with that education piece of either when a building needs to not do that for kind of technical reasons or for outdoor air quality. And then there was an interesting question from Giles about, do solar panels reduce heating load on a building, and how does retrofitting them work? I haven't seen specific research on solar panels, but I have seen some really interesting research on mixed roof. So roofs where you have panels above and see them, or some kind of green roof underneath the solar panel, and that's meant to be a very good environment. That definitely reduces the heat effect on that roof. So I have seen this hybrid system and some really cool research on that. So have a look at those, Giles. Hybrid system of solar with green underneath.
Yeah, because the extreme heat affects the efficiency of the system. So the green cools the ambient temperature and makes it a lot more efficient. I just want to apologize, Ricky. I skipped over one slide.
And green roofs grow better under solar. Agriculture, vines, including in England, grow better under solar. So it's that double benefit.
That double benefit. Ricky, I'd love to jump over to your slides and presentation if you would like to share.
Sure. Yeah, so this is actually, absolutely. We can go through this quite quickly in the interest of time. Appreciate. So this is kind of just showing the value of data for looking at this issue of urban heat island and particular heat exposure. So what does that mean? And we talked a little bit about the fact that indoor heat exposure is not the same as outdoor, and we should kind of be looking at these two things. But we don't know an awful lot about indoor heat exposure. It's much harder to do kind of remote sensing than the usual approach. So at the Pathways to Equitable Healthy Cities project, which I'm a part of, we have stakeholders in Ghana, Accra, Dakar, Bangladesh, and all over the world. We're kind of running a campaign right now to not only look at urban heat island effects from kind of remote sensing and GIS data, so building density, green space prevalence, but also looking at the characteristics of individual buildings. So looking at this kind of complex interaction in the sense that the built environment contributes to the urban heat island, but also the built environment and like the nature of buildings affects kind of the indoor temperature that one is exposed to. If you'd like to head over to the next slide. And so what we're really trying to do right now is just to measure, and we talked about, the prevalence of smart sensors and so on. Sensors can be acquired, and provided you get the consent of various communities, you can just measure, what are people genuinely experiencing. And another thing we haven't talked an awful lot about, but actual heat exposure to people is a combination of both temperature and humidity. So measuring this everywhere is very important. We're in the process of doing this right now in Accra in 150 locations, along with measurements of various built environment characteristics to not only model what the urban heat island is, but how it kind of enters the home and the effect there. Next slide. And finally, what I'll mention is that we don't often have very good data. So even in high income cities, we don't have kind of building level data characteristics, and we are working on ways of applying computer vision to existing data sets to kind of try and assess the built environment characteristics of individual buildings, to not only help us model what the kind of urban heat island is and what the kind of most significant factors might be contributing towards it, but also broadly to estimate what the temperatures might be inside those homes. So that's one way in which data is really helping us to understand the effect of the built environment in cities. Very briefly, I'll also mention weather prediction is a huge arena right now. There's loads of interesting work going on, and that will have a massive impact on the way that we think about heat action plans and preparedness.
Wonderful, really great slides. It's nice to see it visually and have a look at all the research that's happening with the data sets. It's interesting that we can do this without even needing to visit a site. Everything's remote now.
Yeah, I mean, the validity of models should always be checked. And that's why I would stress, we get data on the ground as well. Never trust them. Always be empirical. And then once you validate it, feel free to go nuts with the fancy AI. That's kind of our philosophy.
I like it. Straight from the scientist's mouth. That's good. Fantastic. Okay, so I'd like to look at closing now. I'd like to thank the panel for joining us today. And as a reminder to our audience, we really do appreciate your time and effort and valuable contribution and participation. I hope you've learned a lot, as much as we can offer within 1 hour. We will publish a recording of this webinar online and a written summary. So please do feel free to share this within your professional networks, because I think one thing we have identified very clearly during our conversation is that it takes a collective to make big impacts. So if you're very passionate about this topic, please do share the webinar with your professional colleagues and use it as a talking platform for new innovative solutions. You can reach out to each of our panelists on LinkedIn. I presume everyone has a LinkedIn here. And then please let us know what you thought of today's session by completing the online poll. We're very, very grateful for the organisers of this session today. If we go to the next slide, I think we have a number of exciting future events coming up as part of the RICS World Built Environment Forum podcast series. So please do take a look, have a listen, and let us know what you think. For more information, you can reach out to the World Built Environment Forum on the following platforms. So I've been Sophia Key. Thank you so much for having me here from Dubai. Thank you to all of the panelists. It's been an absolute pleasure. And thanks to the audience for your participation and active listening.
Thanks, everyone.
Sophia, can you stay on?